In this module, we'll begin to discuss friction as it affects the labor markets. So far, we've really talked about the effect of perfect competition in freely flowing markets and tried to develop some of the models and forms and equations that will help us understand these markets. In this section, we'll briefly consider why different workers receive different wages. So we're going to hit this question again. We'll then look at going from freely flowing markets to markets in friction. We'll look at a couple of different segments helping us quantify and graph and consider the values of friction in these markets. Then we'll briefly look at how different workers are receiving different pay. And then we'll look at the effects of mobility, monopsony, and discrimination in the labor market. Only we'll look at those effects very briefly as we will look at them in greater detail further on in our course. So to begin with, let's consider this question again. Why do different workers receive different wages? We said that this was a central theme to the course, a central question we're going to answer in the course, and of course it is. But as we've talked about the course so far, we really haven't tried to answer that or haven't really come back to the question itself. If we think about it, we actually have covered some of the elements that help us understand why different workers receive different wages. We have this supply and demand relationship in the marketplace that we are now very familiar with, where we have a supply of labor, some demand for labor in a labor and wage environment that brings us to some equilibrating value of L star and W star. So depending upon what kind of worker this is, then this is going to give us an idea as to how many workers will be hired and how much each one of them will be paid. And this market model will be different for each type of worker in the market. This might be a market model for low-skilled workers, and it will yield a separate W star and L star from, say, a different market of moderately skilled workers or high-skilled workers or engineers or program managers or developers or surgeons, etc. So the supply and demand and the equilibrating forces of supply and demand for any type of worker in any labor market will identify, assuming that we have a freely flowing market, will identify the wage they're going to be paid and how many of them will end up having jobs. This obviously is being differentiated by the skill sets of these workers. And so we're going to see a different labor supply and labor demand for any different skill set or type of worker that we can think of. Also, we have to think about this wage as being more of a compensation than simply a wage. We might think of a wage as being a certain dollar per hour or a certain dollar per week or per month or maybe even per year, and that would be the cash wage. But really, we have to begin to think about what's referred to as a compensating wage differential. Let's assume for a moment that the wage that was established for a particular type of worker is $10 an hour. And yet, a worker has presented himself or herself to an employer that only is offering $9 an hour in actual cash wages, but another $1 per hour in terms of vacation benefits, health insurance benefits, and maybe some perks on the job. Or perhaps the going wage is $10 an hour, and yet a worker presents themselves to an employer and again is only offered $9 an hour, but the environment in which they're going to be working is so far exceeding anything else in the area. It has free lunches, there is a massage therapist on staff that will help you release some tension in the afternoon or whatever it might be, and a beautiful environment. There's places to play ping pong and billiards and to catch some sleep if you need to. And so the differential between the compensation and the wage in this case might be able to be valued in some dollars, which would bring the entirety of this compensation package up to the W star level that we might think about. So that's a compensating wage differential. You might go to work for an employer for a lesser dollar amount, and in terms of your actual wages that you'll see in a paycheck, presuming you get some other benefits that bring you up to that total W star amount. And we think of that then as the compensation. Well, those are some of the elements that we might have thought about or talked about in terms of why different workers might receive different wages in a freely flowing market. And the compensating wage differential part of that we'll discuss in much greater detail later on in this course. But the other part, supply, demand, equilibrium, recognizing that different workers have different skill sets that will bring about different levels of W star and L star, that should be fairly common to us now. We should understand that pretty readily and certainly understand how to model it, graph it, and to calculate it and what those terms might mean. Now let's move to friction in the markets. We might find that based upon some mobility factor that different workers receive different wages. Perhaps a worker is required to move across the country to capture a new job, and that worker then is going to be expecting a higher wage. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to justify the expense of moving across the country. And so they're expecting a higher wage for their skill set than they could have received in the area in which they were moving from. Those are the same worker, but different wages at different places. Maybe we have something referred to as monopsony in the market, which we'll talk about in some detail here within this module in a further segment and in much greater detail in yet a different module in the course. But something referred to as monopsony in the market, where the buyers of labor, or the firms, producers, have some significant power over the workers, some producer power over the workers, such that they're able to dictate a wage. They become wage setters. In the earliest part of the course, and in free-flowing markets with competitive labor markets, then we know that workers are wage takers and firms are wage takers as well. Neither of them set the wage. They just accept the wage that is identified by this supply and demand structure yielding W star and L star. But when we get into the friction area of the market, we now are dealing with imperfect labor markets, and so we might find that this friction yields some difference in wage based upon some preference from the employer or the employee. So it might be an issue of mobility, it might be an issue of monopsony, so some buying power on the part of a very large employer, or maybe it's a labor union. Or it might be the effect of discrimination. Here we have two workers. They both appear to have the exact same characteristics in terms of education, in terms of productivity, in terms of their ability to communicate, but they have different colors of skin. And in some parts of the labor market, they would be paid differently. And we call that discrimination. So these are some of the reasons, the very basic, broad reasons that different workers receive different wages.